Hey everyone, Jiří here, and in this video I will show you how you can document your design system using Supernova inbuilt documentation editor and how you can distribute this documentation to your team members, be it designers, developers, or just whoever is interested in your design system. Now, what better way how to show you than actually create one documentation, probably from scratch, so I propose we get started. The first thing that you see on my screen is of course the design system that we've been creating over the course of this series. So we have all the tokens, all the components imported, and also the assets. We don't have code just yet, but we will actually get to the code for the first time in this video. So let's wait for that. Now, the first thing in order to access the documentation, so I will click the Edit Docs button, and this will bring the documentation editor. Now, in order to understand the documentation well, we first have to explain how the documentation gets started. Now, each design system inside Supernova contains one and exactly one design system documentation. There is one-to-one connection between your design system data and your documentation. And this allows you to do many interesting things, such as use your design system data like tokens, like components or assets inside the documentation. Now this video is quite long, so if you are interested in specific topic, feel free to jump ahead using the timestamps that I've added below. Now in this documentation, I would like to see several things. I would like to see my color palettes being shown properly, and ideally so they update themselves when I make changes to them. I would like to see assets, so my developers, my designers can download them and maybe see the library that they have available. And I would also like to see my components rendered. Ideally, my components would not be just images, but real life components. And that seems like a lot of work. In many cases, large companies usually opt to create their custom documentation just so they have all the capabilities like this. But in case of Supernova, you get everything, including the design system integration, right from the beginning. So I will just show you how you can do some of those things. And for specific topics, I will dive deeper in a specific videos. So let's start with the introduction. We have some welcome page here, and what I would like to highlight is maybe our primary core brands, like just what colors do represent our design system. I wrote a text already, and to explain you a little bit how you work with the Supernova editor, if you have ever used tools like Notion or Google Docs, you can just use the same principles. Specifically for the documentation editor of Supernova, you can also write commands. This is actually my preferred choice how to write the documentation, because I can then do everything from my keyboard, and it's actually really quick to do this. So for example, if I want to add a new header, I would just write slash and header, and I can select whether I want the largest one or maybe the small section header. So I think the medium one would be good, and it creates a new heading, and I can immediately type the heading description. So it would be my brand. Let's just call it the brand, and let's add some description. So let's say my brand consists of those primary colors. And now we would like to reference some of the information that we have inside the design system. So using the same principle that we've already done in writing the header, for example, we can spawn another block, but for a different purpose. There is a lot of blocks for very different purposes. We can actually see all of this when we just write slash, and you will see the list, including some media blocks, everything that you need to highlight your text and so on. But we also have some more advanced blocks, which actually allow you to reference the design system elements that you have directly. And specifically for this purpose, there is one block that will serve us well, which is the token list. And that one allows us to select specific tokens from our library and then render them inside the documentation. So I will select this block, and I will also select that I want the color tokens to be shown. And now I'm presented with all the tokens that I have available inside inside the design system itself. And those tokens can be either imported from Figma, or they can be created in Supernova, or they can also be imported through Supernova API. So in this case, I will just select some of the tokens that represent my brand. Don't really care about what values those are too much, but you of course will. And now I have created a list of tokens that basically represent my brand. What is important to note here is that what you are seeing is just the editor, but your front-end experience can actually vary depending on your liking. So what I will do, just to showcase you this, I will publish this documentation, and then we will go to the documentation side to see how the documentation looks like. So the way this works is that in Supernova, there is basically a template that powers every documentation, and that template is available to you. We call the system exporters. And in this template, you can change any aspect of the documentation. You can change how the layout works, how the documentation looks like, and you can also change how each of the blocks is rendered inside the documentation. So if we view this documentation side, you will see that the visual representation of those tokens is actually very different from the default one that is here inside the editor. I have changed it so it renders as tiles. And you can go ahead and just using HTML and JavaScript change those templates again, so you can completely render different experiences. If you are an agency, you can render a different documentation, but using the same data for each of the client. If you are a very large company and you need a lot of customization, you can create any kind of documentation that you like to with Supernova, but you can still use the superpowers that the editor does give you. We will cover this entire topic in different video, but for now, that's all that you need to know. I would propose that we continue building this documentation. So what I will do, I will just add another page, or actually I will add another group and call it our style guide. So in the style guide, what I would like to see is maybe a few other pages. One of the pages would probably represent our pallets. So let's do that. And another page could represent our textiles. That would be nice. And then the last one, I just want to highlight all the assets that we have available inside Supernova. So now I have 3 new pages inside category called Style Guide. And if I publish my documentation again, we will have a new category and new pages available there. So let's start with the color palettes. Now I'll probably rename this to color styles. That just makes more sense. And what I will write here is, this is all the colors that you can use inside in our design system. That sounds great. And now I would like to highlight some of the color palettes that people can use. So I will not spend too much time on the content really, just to showcase you what is possible. But I will use another block that we have already seen, the token list. I could highlight the tokens separately one by one by selecting each one of them, but that's probably too cumbersome. So we have another block. We have a lot of blocks for different purposes, but for this specific one, there is a block that is called token group, and this allows you to reference an entire group or even the entire library of the tokens at the same time. So I will just select a green one, for example, and now you can see that we have the entirety of the green palette shown and rendered inside the documentation. And in order to maybe show more, I will add another palette. So let's just write and another, and add another group, this time maybe a teal one. And now I have 2 palettes referenced in this design page, and I also have the content that updates dynamically, because one thing that is important to note about this is that everything here uses the live data. So if you make a change inside Figma or inside Supernova or inside or through the API, I should say, then this content will change as well. So for example, if I would tweak the green color to be something slightly different, I don't have to manually go inside the documentation. I can just let Supernova do its work and this will propagate automatically. If I add more tokens into this group or remove it, then it will propagate as well. Let me republish this documentation site so we can see how the color styles are rendered when they are presented to my users. So now the documentation has been published and I can just go again to view, and this time you can see that we have a new group called Styleguide, and in this Styleguide we have 3 pages, 2 of them are empty, but we'll get to this. But we have color styles, and in the color styles we have all the tokens, but again rendered differently than what is inside the editor. You can just access this template that is used to render each of the blocks and change completely to your liking. Now let's continue and build the remaining of pages in the style guide. So what I would like to do is I would like to add text styles here, and to do this, again, I will just add a token group, but this time maybe I will select the typography. And in here I don't have a group defined, so I really just want to show all the tokens, and for this reason we have this category called ungrouped tokens, which basically takes everything that you didn't really order or didn't put into a separate groups. So as you can see, it will render the entirety of the library that I have defined, all the tokens, all the text styles that are defined. So now with the text styles done, I would like to add the assets so people can, so my team members can download them. And to do this, again, same principle as with everything else, I will just add another block, but this time I will just write asset. And indeed there is a block that allows you to link assets, and the assets are rendered directly from Figma and also from our library that we maintain. So you can actually see all the icons, all the assets, all the branding material that you have linked into the Supernova directly under this view. And I probably just want to render one variant, the regular icons, so I will just select render all of them. I will confirm, and now you can see that we have all the icons inside Supernova. Of course, there is quite a lot of customization options. I would like to make them a little bit smaller maybe, so this works well. Let me republish the documentation, and now we will get all the color styles, all the text styles, and also all the assets, so they are available for download for my team members. So going into the documentation and maybe going into the assets, you can indeed see that in the documentation side, I now have all the icons available and my users can download them. As a last thing that I would like to show you in this video is how you can document the components, because components are a critical piece of any design system, right? It's not about tokens, it's not about the assets, it's usually about the components. And components are also the ones that are probably the most difficult to document, because they contain not only the design aspect, but also the code aspect. And in many cases, the code actually takes precedence. You know, the code base is what drives the design system. So I would like to create one page that basically represents one component that also comes from a live code base. Now I will create a new group and call it components, and I will also create a new page that I will call button. Now in this page I would like to document a live button, basically something that already exists in my code base. I could render the button from Figma, I could render all the variants that is possible inside Supernova, but I specifically want to use my code base to represent this button in more natural way, because it has already been coded, so it's best representation of the design system that we have. Now, because I don't want to just invent something, I found a design system, and this is the design system that I'm talking about, that we will try to replicate. So it's the Sprout Social Seeds design system. It's actually really great. They have some really good ideas about how you represent tokens, and also visually it's very appealing. So we'll use their content and we will try to get as close as possible to what they are doing. So let's take their text at first. Let me also close all of this so we know what's going on. And let's just copy paste this. Okay, so now we know that button is used to trigger actions based on user interaction. Good start, but as the next thing, we have something that is usually extremely complicated, which is actually a live preview of those code components. So how would we do this? We have several choices. The very first, if you are using web components especially, is probably that you would embed something like Storybook, right? And that's certainly possible with Supernova, because you can just add a block that says Storybook, obviously. And we have integrations with many services like this. And we could embed the Storybook canvas, and if you are using Storybook, this is a great choice. But sometimes you don't want to spread your documentation over several sites. So we have better options how to do this. And one of the best choices is actually to show and to use your live code from your code base to render the components directly inside the documentation. And to do this, what I will do, I will just type React, because those are React components. And in here, we have a block that is specifically purposed to render a React code. So I will add this block, and as you will see, this is actually a live component. This is a component that has been compiled from the code that is used or written here. And to show you, we can just remove this, and you will see that the button, the component changes. So this live code actually allows you to render any kind of React components as long as you can bring enough data to represent them inside Supernova. Now they have code examples here, so we could actually copy paste this code and use this code in order to render the same thing that they have here. But to do this, we first need to somehow reference how their library that they are using to render those components. And to do this, I will go to settings, and in here we have a template or package JSON that you can use to represent your dependencies. So in here you can see that I only reference a React and React DOM as a references, but I actually need many more libraries in order to start rendering their seeds components, because there is their own library and then also some dependencies like moment, date, and so on. So I have a new different package JSON here, and I will take it from my second screen and copy paste it. And here, as you can see, I've added many other dependencies. So the entire Sprout social design system, their colors, borders, and so on, and also some other React dependencies that are needed for all of this to work. You can just copy paste your package JSON that you have, and it will contain the dependencies that we need. I'll update this so the package JSON gets accepted. And if we go to the component, you will see, okay, it's still React, it still renders because it's a default React code. But now we can actually use their code that they have on the side to render their components. So I will add this. And now, as you can see, it actually renders their own components. So if we go to their documentation page, you can see the default, primary, secondary, destructive, and so on. And you have the same thing here. Now, one thing that is worth noting that you will definitely be interested in is that in this editor, the view is not interactive because there is a lot of functionality as an overlay on top of that. For example, you can be resizing this view and so on. However, once you publish this documentation, this interactive layer becomes available, and so all the components of course behave as you would expect, and they are fully interactive depending on what you put here. So we can just view the site, and now we should see our component sort of documented with the live code. And indeed, if you click on those buttons, they actually do behave like they should. Now, this is not embed or something, this is really just live code rendered inside your documentation. And as with everything that I've shown you, it is completely possible to restyle this or change it in any form or shape that you want to. Of course, you can toggle the code that was used to render this component, you can copy paste the code and so on, or you can even add extra functionality but just by changing the underlying template. But that's not all that I want to do, because they still have quite a lot here. For example, they have those properties. Now, those properties were probably written by a developer, and they were probably written inside the repository that contains all of those buttons. So what I would like to do is actually use the existing documentation of this component and just embed it into the documentation inside Supernova. So what I will do, I will go to my GitHub, and in here I have a markdown that was written that explains this button component, and I will take a link to this markdown, and then I will add another block. Everything inside the documentation is block, so we'll talk just about blocks. And this time I will just write markdown. And this markdown block allows you to embed and basically restructure the markdown so it fits your documentation. And as you will see, when we import this markdown, it will actually look like a natural part of this documentation, even though it has been created in completely different environment. So in here, let me just refresh the page. And indeed, as you can see, we now have a button which has a live code, live component, and also all the button properties, all the best practices, and some description of how we can use this button. One last thing that I would like to show you is how you can change the template that I was talking about inside your documentation. And to do this, I was thinking, hey, we've already taken the entire content of this component page. Why not to take the entire page, as in entire design system documentation, and make the design so it fits the Sprout social schema that they are using? And I went ahead before this video and I've done just that. So if we go to settings, you will see something that we call active exporter. This is basically the package that contains all the templates. And in here, I have installed another template, which is basically just HTML and JavaScript combined together. And I can switch between the default documentation now and the Seeds design system. So if I switch this, and then if I go back to the editor, you will see that nothing really changed, right? The data are still the same. But if I go and I publish this documentation, then what it will do is it will re-render the entire documentation using that new template, and it will give you much different experience. So going back to the site, you can see that this is the old one, but if we actually reload the page, you will see that the documentation completely changed. The data is still the same. However, the layout and the presentation and the way how the components are rendered, for example, even the styling of the code is different. If we go to introduction page, you can see that now the tiles are rendered completely differently. I've even added extra functionality that shows you the hex color when you hover over the token. And if we go to Styleguide, instead of table, we now present our colors in this nice scheme that is also taken from the Seeds design system. So I can actually create and customize the documentation to a level of simply the last character on the site. You can truly change any aspect of the documentation. But that's not all, because I still have one more thing to show you. And then, there are dedicated videos that go in depth into all of those features. And this one feature is very specifically designed so you can extend the functionality of your documentation. Because in many cases, documentations require something custom, right? And if you would be using service like Supernova and we would have only a limited number of functionalities, say the blocks that you have available, then in many cases you would find the custom solutions to be superior because they would give you control over adding a new functionality. But we actually went ahead and we have created a technology inbuilt into those templates that allows you to contribute a new functionality back into Supernova as well. So you have the default native experience, but because we have changed the exporter, because we have changed the template, we have also loaded some additional functionality that we can now use. And the functionality I've taken from the Seeds design system, which is this healthy indicator. I really like how they present it, and I also really like that you can actually click on this and it shows you an overlay basically that represents whether the component is healthy or not. And it also shows you maybe that you can download the component where you can access the code. It's actually really useful. And so if I go back to Supernova, you will see that compared to the default experience, there is now a health indicator. It's basically a custom block that was created, that was contributed by that template. And I have 3 types, but for the purpose of this video, I will just use one, and that is dynamic health, which I created. So this is my completely custom block that is used inside Supernova. And this block was configured, so it asks me for one, and specifically just one property, and that is the component ID. Now I've made this block so that if you select a component ID, it actually asks this very specific a Excel spreadsheet, and it fetches the values that are represented here about the component. So here I can just take the ID of the button and add it here. Now I will go and publish the documentation, and everything should work. So I will just reload this page, and you can see that indeed my button is now withering, because that's what we said inside the health status, and it has all the properties that are defined in this Excel spreadsheet. So I can just click on this, and I've even replicated the functionality. Now the custom blocks give you really unparalleled powers in terms of how you can customize your documentation. You can have this super powered Supernova editor and also the design system manager, but you can also make the documentation exactly to your liking, extend the functionality beyond the native capabilities, which are already very powerful. We will talk about all of this in the specific videos. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.